What is soulmaking? What is wisdom? And who is an elder? This series explores advanced personal biographies from across the metamodern, developmental, transformational, and regenerative networks. Our job is to midwife the becoming of the liminal elders by eliciting the stories of their lives and creating a container to hold them. Arguably the most ancient and reliable form of depth transmission resides simply in verbalizing the self-curated tale of the adventures, misadventures, and miracles of a complex human being who has spent decades prioritizing wisdom, growth, and relationship. Pay attention with your heart, soak up what you can, because one day they'll be dead, and the task of eldership will fall to you. That's my wager. I'm Layman Pascal.
I'm Cheryl Shu. Welcome to Soulmakers.
Our first companion is Bruce Alderman, producer of The Integral Stage, teacher, scholar, author, meditator, linguist, dreamer, experimental artist, world traveler, husband, father, and son. Hi, Bruce. So, thank you for helping us start this series off. We obviously don't know what we're doing yet, but we'll be guided by curiosities. I think we're generally interested in like gritty, human, interesting details on the one hand, but also the journey of self-revelation and strange experiences and shifts in your sense of self on the other hand. So we'll take some time. We'll go at it.
I noticed it would be really wonderful to arrive in some silence together first.
Okay.
And yeah, I noticed like a desire to get to know this field. If you're open to that.
Okay. Yeah, let's take a few minutes. Cheryl and I often end up sitting silently for most of an hour, but let's do a couple of minutes.
Okay, not an hour. Thank you. I'll just share. I really appreciated. Thank you for taking that moment of presence. And I was actually feeling like this very, very almost overwhelmingly alive fecundity of the heart. It was very, yeah, there was a sense of everything just being incredibly ripened. Yeah, almost to the extent to which like there was a desire to root and center amidst it. So just really appreciating it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for opening the field up that way.
Hey, maybe I'll sort of situate us in a chronology here. Where and when were you born? And do you have any pre-birth memories?
I was born in Houston, Texas, and I have some experiences which feel like a resonance of familiarity with a place that obviously were not part of my biography, at least up to the point that I had those experiences. And so I don't know if that would count as that. I don't have any recollections of perinatal experience, anything like that. But there were two times in my life, one in a dream where I was by a river moving up and down some stairs amidst a lot of buffalo. And another time when I was in Arizona and I was walking in a forest and I rounded a bend and it had opened up into a clearing and it just stopped me in my tracks with recognition. And I thought, even though I had never been there, I thought this looks just like India. This looks like someplace I know in India. And so later, traveling to India and being in Varanasi, one, of course, I was on the ghats and by the buffalo and all the stairs, and I recognized that that was what I was seeing in the dream. And somebody from Varanasi actually was encouraging me to open a school in India. And he had a piece of property, and he drove me all day out to it to go look at the property and suggest that I might open a school there. And when I saw that, I was shocked because it looked like what I was seeing in Arizona. And so you could see that this would maybe a premonition of something in the future, but it was also such a recognition that maybe there had been some connection there in the past, if you want to entertain the metaphysical possibilities around that. Yeah. But yeah, I was born in Houston and lived there for a few years, kind of upper middle class family. My father was in an advertising agency, and my mother, at least initially, was stay-at-home mother, and she was very attentive and very artistic. So there were a lot of artistic activities and a lot of support in that regard. After a few years, we moved to Portland, Oregon, and that was a big change from Texas in terms of the people and in terms of the environment, the climate. And then we settled back to Texas. But we can go into story narration. I just wanted to, that's like the very earliest years was Houston. The only thing I remember from my first home was a swing set. And I was on the swing set, and we had a big white cat. And the big white cat came up behind me and swiped my diapers off. That's the only thing I remember from that house.
And how long did you spend in Oregon?
I think we were there a couple years. I got married. There was a girl next door named Jennifer, and I really liked her. She really liked me. We got married in the living room and had our honeymoon under the dining room table.
And what year is that when you get married and have your honeymoon under the dining room table?
I would say that's probably 69, something like that.
Do you remember what Jennifer was like?
I do. She had long hair and she was slender. She was very friendly. I grew up later in high school to be very shy and not easily open to talking to other people. But at this time, that was not part of it. And I was, that was not part of my makeup. And I would easily walk up and talk with people. And I often had a very caretaking relationship with people at that time. And I remember, something happening to her on a playground in her backyard. And I was running over there and tending to her, and just felt, connected to her and her family. And they were a little bit richer than our family was. So they had all the nicer things in the den. And we had a nice too, but theirs was really, really nice. So we often had, adults would have the parties at one or the other house, and then we would wander around between the goings on. I do remember, I think actually my parents and her parents had left a lot of half-finished martinis and things all over the tables. And when they were in another room, I wandered around and finished it all off. And so, I think I probably was a little bit tipsy for the remainder of that evening.
And how old were you when you moved back to Texas?
Yeah, I think I must have been like maybe 5, 6 years old, something like that. And we first settled into an apartment. And as my father was, getting a job at another advertising agency, and we first settled into an apartment until we could get a home. And one of the early things I remember there was right across from the apartment was this big field where a bunch of earth-moving machines had torn up all of the ground, and it was filled with crevices and ditches and holes. And, that became my refuge. I would, after school, run over there and have adventures in all of the holes and crevices in that big torn up ground. But I don't have very many recollections from that early phase. We then, at that apartment, but then we moved over to a neighborhood where I spent a number of years, and we were in, I think it was, again, it was a middle-class neighborhood, and we had a really tight-knit group of friends and families all on this cul-de-sac. And a lot of my memories there are from just the after school times or the summer times where we would just, as they did back then, set the kids loose. And, we would just be out for hours and hours and exploring, usually hunting frogs and other things under the street lights. And there was a bayou that, this is in Houston. So there was this bayou at the end of the cul-de-sac, and all of this spear grass. I don't know if you know spear grass, but spear grass is this, grass with a little sharp thing, and you can actually throw it. So we used to have these spear grass wars at the end of the cul-de-sac, and go down into the bayou. We had, for me, being in the middle of the city, it was actually some of my earliest encounters with nature, which is really interesting for me, in that we had a lot of different animal encounters there. We had a lightning struck owl that sat for days in front of my friend's house. There was a cobra that came into a garage and battled our friend's collie. And there were, skunks and all kinds of other animals moving through the area, raccoons, lots of raccoons. Mm. But there was also a sense of danger in that area. I remember some older kids came from the other side of the bayou, and they would meet us and challenge us sometimes at the creek, where we would, cross from to either side. And one kid was throwing things at me, and I remember getting in a scuffle with him, and he turned out to be a little bit stronger than me. But somehow I managed to get an advantage over him and knocked him down, and he fell down part of the bayou and into the water and started crying. And I felt so bad about that. I just could not really entertain violence in that way, that I invited him to come up and push me into the water to equalize things. And so he did. He came up and pushed me in the water, and then we settled things. But the danger that was there, my sister one day went down there to play, and I was not there. One of my friends was looking over the edge of the bayou, and apparently a strange man wandered up to her, exposed himself, and tried to grab her. And my friend hollered, and she screamed, and she racked the man and ran away. And he saw he was being witnessed, and she was able to escape. And I remember we ended up having to go to court. My friend, I was in there, but my friend trying to identify the perpetrator on that. And that friend who did that, he ended up becoming a friend for me, but he was also the major bully of the street. And he was a few years older than me and used to torment me a lot, until one day I couldn't take it anymore. He was, every time we were having a game, he'd rip my jacket or he'd do something to me, and he was like a head taller than me or more. But I couldn't take it anymore. I flipped into a rage mode and just went after him fiercely and ended up chasing him all over the neighborhood. And he was laughing and screaming simultaneously because he didn't know what was going to happen. But finally, I tackled him in front of his house and had him finally. His shoulders were under my knees. His face was right there. I was ready to just pummel his face, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. So I just like thumped him on the head and said, "Had enough?" And, his mom came out and yelled at us. But those were like these boundary testing kind of early experiences, and also kind of my encounter of how do you navigate these tension spots and these, male, power negotiating spots. And for me, they were always uncomfortable. I found that I could do it, but I never wanted to do it.
What's your sister's name?
Lori. I have two sisters, Lori and Amy. And Lori is, she was the early responsible one, especially as my parents started working more. She became kind of mini mother in the house. And my younger sister, Amy, was the wild, free spirit who she might be dressed like a ballerina one day and a cowboy the next day and an army, combat veteran the next day. I mean, she put on whatever costume she could find and ran out and had adventures in the street. So very different characters.
What kind of role did you play between them?
I was both storyteller and entertainer to them, and annoying big brother who tormented them. And so we had a good, relationship in some ways. In some ways, I gave them too hard of a time, hiding their dolls or, doing things with their toys that made them upset. But overall, we grew into having a strong, solid relationship, especially in later years as our family went through a lot of challenges. We got very close.
So your relationship with your dad at this time? I mean, he sounds like he's right out of Mad Men, like a late 60s advertising guy. What was your impression of him?
Yeah, I was impressed with him. I was amazed at his kind of work that he was doing. He would take us to his office, and at the time, this was, back in the 70s, I think, right? And they did advertising primarily for the Houston oil industry and some other things. But they had this campaign where they had visualized, before I saw it anywhere else, I hadn't seen it in films. You know how all the films now have the digital displays just floating in space, right? That this is like the sign of the future, is that you have everything just floating in space without screens. So they had created this advertising campaign of a room full of people with this luminous digital display in the middle of the room. As they were like, tracking different things on oil rigs, going on across the Gulf. And so I was impressed by, wow, what kind of creativity is he able to do to, in this industry? And he would bring me to his office and show me what that space was like. And I was impressed because they were all creative, wild, spirited types. I would walk down the hallway, and one guy had a big basket full of crumpled up pieces of paper on things that he'd been writing, and he was hiding behind his desk, and he would just bean people going down the hall with the paper, and so they were a very playful spirit in there, and I was really impressed with that. My father was gentle. He loved things like Buck Rogers and the old films. He would take us to these old films at the Dollar Movie, and he loved astronomy. My very first word was telescope. My second word was light. My third word was flower. Fourth was mom. Right. But they would always take me out into the backyard and watch the stars and watch the garden. And he's, was a retired Navy guy, but he was very much into Air Force and NASA. He used to take us to NASA because it was not that far, and we'd go explore, the space center there. And he was always very creative. So he would always tell us stories at night, and draw pictures for us. We'd ask him to envision space people and aliens, and he'd make pictures for us. And so there's a lot of fun, creative relationship with him. My mother too. Both of them were very creative types.
You've got some classically shamanic attributes in what you've described. The ability to play in the competitive world of the men in the village, but not really being interested in that, seeing your own conclusions leading you somewhere else. This sense of being an entertainer and a performer for your siblings. This attraction to nature and the animals that are in your area. I'm wondering if you recollect other things that might fall into that mode, or if there were other sort of things that you would now think of as signs of that disposition, different kinds of states or visions or hints of the kind of person you might become.
Yes, it really grew when we moved to the next location from that one. I don't remember if it was when I was living at the first, neighborhood I was just describing, or the one that followed. But I remember going out into a park with my family, and everybody was walking and talking about, something. I don't know exactly what they were talking about. But for me, I was startled by the brilliant clarity and multidimensionality of nature all around me. It's like I could see the trees from multiple sides. I could see every little wrinkle on the bark. It was just like shimmering and dancing for me. And I was talking to my parents and trying to say, there's something about this. I couldn't describe my state. I didn't have the language for it at that time. I just said, don't you see, it's so 3D? That's the only thing I could really say. But for me, it was just this amazing dance that I really felt just like touched to be part of. And that and the sky was really attractive for me. And I was fascinated by how far out it went. For me, my experience of my brain was as a very deep, dark well full of luminous points of light like stars. And so I felt like this mirroring between the sky and my experience of what my brain was. Everybody said brains back then. So for me, all of the little points of light that I would visualize when I closed my eyes to experience my brain, those were the brains. Those were all the little, I had no, anatomical knowledge yet. But there was that sense of connection and participation. And in one of our UFO series videos, I think I talked about how when my father brought me to watch Close Encounters, the movie, and when the big mothership came, and that scene with the big mothership coming, I just burst out glossolalia, speaking in tongues in the middle of the theater. I was so filled with ecstasy at this connection with the deep intelligence of the universe that was my first, you could say, strong classically mystical experience, besides seeing the multidimensionality of the world in that park. But then as we moved to that other neighborhood, it was really a lovely place. We were at the end of a street, and we had a front yard and a backyard, but also a side yard. And then behind us was many acres of a bird sanctuary. And so we had on the side yard, there was a bowl, and my father had put a swing over it so that we could swing over that big bowl or indentation. And then you go further off and there are trails, and we called it the spaghetti bowl. There were all these trails through the woods, and they all crossed. And so we would like ride our bikes out there. But I remember I would just go out there and just bury myself in the woods, I would build, forts, and I could spend all day out there. And, I had a BB gun. I shot a crow once, and it just tore me up. I couldn't handle what had just happened, and I brought the crow home and I cared for it. And so there was all that feeling of that connection and participation in the woods then. One thing that stands out there also is another kind of encounter with danger at the edge of what was wilderness for me. There was on the far side of the bird sanctuary was a church, and there was a parking lot, and I'd sometimes go through all the forest with my kite and then come out the other side and go fly a kite in the church parking lot. And this guy was circling the parking lot on a bicycle, and I noticed that he kept kind of like narrowing the circle. And I was alone in the parking lot flying the kite, and I had a dog with me. But as he got close enough, I remember that my teacher a week ago had said, watch out for a guy, a little bit heavy guy on a silver bicycle. He's basically a child predator, and he's been hunting children. And as this guy got closer and closer, I recognized this is the guy. And I started trying to reel in the kite. He noticed I was trying to retreat. He hopped off the bike and ran at me. And I just ran, dragging the kite behind me into the forest. But at that moment, I'm narrating this in part because I felt I didn't actually have any thought at all. I know I couldn't follow the normal trail because it would be too easy for him to follow me on the trail. So I just took off running, but I ran instinctively, and it got me through the forest and into where I needed to be, and completely lost him. But I felt that there was this kind of embodied participation in that landscape that helped me escape,
Did you still feel like he was out there lurking for some time after that?
Yes. Yeah, I was cautious about going back to that parking lot. I did report it, and I think my parents called, the police to say that, he had been around. Luckily, I didn't encounter him again.
I'm curious about shooting the bird, right? And whether it's, you have this strong empathy response after shooting it. And did that surprise you? Had you not been expecting it? Or do you think you kind of were goading yourself into the empathy response by committing the deed? Or did you just want to get right to the threshold? Or what was going on there?
There had been a fascination with death emerging for me at that time. And some years later, I started writing horror stories and really trying to test my ability to accommodate that, and just to scare myself and for fun. But I was becoming fascinated with death, and there was a friend I had down the road, pretty far away. He wasn't a close friend, but he liked to kill small things. And I remember once I had shot with my BB gun, I had shot a lizard on the wall, and the BB had pinned it to the wall. And I was shocked and thrilled by it at the same time. And then when I went to this friend's house, he was doing weird things, building traps to catch animals and things like that. And I thought it was kind of fun. And I was experiencing it as a kind of hunting thing and a fascination. But he began to kind of push it farther, and I was going along, and we caught one lizard and hung it. And then we came back to see it the next day, and I tried to release it, and its head fell off. And that's when it really hit me. We're doing something wrong here. But it didn't really hit me until then. I went out and I was practicing with the BB gun, and I hit that bird, and it was a bigger thing, and it had more intelligence in the eye looking up at me, and I could really feel the conviction of the gaze. With the lizard and with the bugs, you can't feel that as much. But when I really encountered it with the crow, I recognized, because I had a deep empathy towards people, and this is where it kind of like I recognized, oh, this circle of concern is bigger, right? And it really hit me at that point that, this is a line I never want to cross anymore. There had been this kind of discovery of male power, able to control the environment and able to do things. But yeah, as I got into it, I felt like it was as Walking Thunder. I don't know if you know her. She's a medicine woman, a Navajo medicine woman, but she tells a story about how she had killed a lizard out in the desert with her sister, and then had not cooked it or eaten it or anything, and they left it out there. And it was a darkness inside her body that she later worked through and brought out through, shamanic healing ceremony. And I feel like that's the kind of thing that happened to me. I discovered, oh, this is depositing darkness in the body to treat life disrespectfully in this way. One thing I used to like to do, that was part of I liked drawing and things like that, but part of the emerging storytelling self. I don't know if you remember Micronauts, these little figures, and if you remember the Space 1999 TV series. They have the big spaceship. My parents bought me a big one, and I would put Rick Wakeman synthesizer music and basically kind of space age kind of music on. My father had a Rick Wakeman album. He's from Rick Wakeman from Yes, and he had this experimental kind of futuristic synthesizer music, and I would put that on and fly my ship around. But then I got a camera. My dad was a photographer, so I would take all of this stuff out and set up these, I don't know, you call tableaus. I would situate all the characters in different scenes, and then just take pictures and basically assemble a movie out of them. And I later met a friend, down the road on that same neighborhood, and he had a movie camera. So we got into making stop motion films and, playing role of magician or, different kind of magical roles, or we animated some cartoons, stop motion cartoons, little paper cutouts. And, so we got into all of that kind of play for a while, which would eventually flower into a lot more, artistic involvement in later years.
I notice as you're describing these, yeah, they feel very alive as images and experiences from your childhood. And there's both an innocence, like a creative innocence, like this ability and way of being that allows you to just like see and be with the full aliveness and vibrancy of the world, like flying a kite, seeing the stars, being able to be with the depth of the sky and the animals that keep showing up, like the other beings. And at the same time, there's also this danger that's always lurking. Like I was really feeling the darkness of innocence and almost transported back to what it's like when you are a child and experiences that raw in that way. Like there is still always this hyper, almost like an animalistic awareness of predators and danger that's present, that keeps you very close to your body, even while you're playing. So I'm just noticing, I'm noticing that. And the question I actually have is, you had described how you would phrase it to other folks, like the way that you would be, as, can you, like, don't you see it's in 3D? Like, just like this, like, don't you see, like, just like the dimensionality that's present here? And I was feeling in that this longing to communicate, to share, to transmit this way of being in the world. And I wanted to just inquire more deeply into, like, what was that like for you to hold that desire? And did you feel like you were able to share your world with the people around you?
It's a great question. To some degree, yes, but to some degree, no. And I really felt with my parents, there was a way that I could go in sharing pretty openly with them and be understood. I usually only found a couple friends that I could actually open up in that way with. Most people, it was, not like that. And as I progressed in school, it got less and less safe to be that open. Watching my son go through school, I'm amazed that he went through it unscathed compared to the scathing experiences I had. So I don't know, if the culture has changed or if he was just lucky. But yeah, there were a lot of experiences that especially showed up a little bit later in my life, where it became increasingly apparent that the way of being that I had kind of cultivated in those early years was not welcome, and was not understood. So I did, through art and through story, I loved to try to create whole worlds of experience that people could enter. And I self-published my own little books. I would write them and illustrate them, and pass them out in school, things like that. But people enjoyed it, but I was also kind of the weird one because I took time to do those things, and that's not what most people did, right? So it was an edge. It really, I think, shifted when I moved. My parents divorced, and that was a very difficult time, a difficult transition. And we ended up having to leave that neighborhood in Houston, and we relocated to the countryside with my mother, living with my mother and my sisters, and had to start a new life there. And that was quite a transition for me. It was, in one way, a beautiful extension of where we were, because we bought another house at the end of a street. And this time there were 2,000 acres of forest behind my house. So I could just go and get lost back there. And I did. I spent a lot of time in the woods, and there's a whole range of experiences of both wonder and animal contact and nature contact and danger and confrontation that all kind of happened in this environment. But one of the things that was really apparent was, as a city boy moving out to the countryside, I talked in a way that nobody related to. They asked me if I was from England. Where are you from, boy? And they thought I was an odd duck, right? I remember entering that world and vowing I was going to leave my science fiction self behind. I was going to leave my sci-fi and fantasy friends, and I was going to become part of the normal crew of I was moving into like junior high at that time. That lasted about 3 weeks. I found I couldn't hang in those spaces, and I ended up making, more of my kind of friends. But yeah, I don't want to lose the thread of what you were asking. There was a desire to open up fields and spaces of experience and test the boundaries of my experience. So, I would, at the time, this was not a popular thing. I would create whole universes with multiple languages and cultures and religions, and I would dream up all that stuff, and then try to, create stories within those worlds. But I can look back now and see it as a kind of psychic exploration. Like in one of I invented like an origin myth. And yeah, when I look back at it now, I can see the psychological dimensions of it. It was the goddess was Rhea, and she was this luminous shining light that just radiated in all directions and experienced intimacy with everything that she touched, but there was nothing that she was touching except openness. And as she became aware of reaching out with the light into a boundless openness, she realized she was alone. And she became disturbed by the thought of what's beyond where she can reach. And she wasn't sure what's there. And so she enclosed herself with a shell. And that shell became the crust of the earth, or the crust of the planet, right? And then within the crust of the planet, because she had assembled it out of herself, it was alive, but she didn't recognize it. For her, it was just the shell. And within the shell, something began to move. Something was birthed within that shell, its own intelligence. And it began to move around. And she became frightened of what was moving inside her because she couldn't recognize its origin. And so she summoned intentionally into being Gemru, the gray tamer. And what was moving in her was Ergasheb, was her firstborn, but she didn't recognize the firstborn. So Gemru, the gray tamer, went to battle with Ergasheb and ended up exiling Ergasheb, and that got cast out and became the moon. And then the moon became the realm where all of the tormented dead went to live after the earth became populated. So that was this origin story. That was like the setting for the whole part of the fantasy. But for me now, looking back with different eyes, I can feel kind of the psycho-spiritual import of a lot of that.
Yeah, there's an instinct for mythology as something that you can be a participant in, and also an instinct for the cosmic that's very strong here. And the instinct for the cosmic, you mentioned sci-fi and things like that. What is it you're reading at this time as you're sort of differentiating yourself in adolescence from some of the people around you?
Yeah, at the previous place, I had just been swiping books off of my dad's nightstand. So it was Stephen King and things like that that I was reading at that time. And, but really, I was reading a lot of the sci-fi at that time and fantasy. So I was reading, of course, Tolkien and Patricia McKillop and Larry Niven and Isaac Asimov, and a lot of people who were writing the imaginal kind of fiction at that time. little bit later, I read things like Siddhartha. I became very fascinated with myth, and I would go to the library. Especially, I got very interested in Nordic myth, and I read the Elder Edda, and I read the Mabinogion from Irish myth. So I would try to immerse myself in those worlds. And at that time, also, I began, because I was experimenting with languages, I began to seek out grammar books and try to expose myself to very different kinds of languages. So I would seek out books on Navajo or Sioux Lakota grammar, or Chinese or Hindi, things like that I would just try to see what the world was like from those perspectives. And those were the kinds of things I was reading. I didn't really get deeply into, kind of like the philosophy that defines a lot of what I work on now until years later. A lot of this was entertained more through story form and through art. That was my way in.
Mm. Did you ever have like your favorite book, the book that is overcreased? And yeah, just I'm curious.
I was fascinated by the Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever books, but those never became my favorite books. Those became the books I expanded my vocabulary with, because he used all kinds of obscure words like tenebrous and, but what really stands out to me, I liked Tolkien, I liked a lot of different things, but there was a series, The Riddle Master of Head by Patricia McKillop. And there was a harpist and a wizard. And yeah, the harpist wizard, his name was Death, Deth. But the imagery in those stories really haunted me. There were these beings that came out of the ocean, and when you looked at the beings, you could see kind of the green shifting of tide that and the white foam that kind of moved in cycles up and down their bodies. That's what I recall. And Death was very unified with this mountain. So for me, there was this kind of deep, again, nature participation that was, communicated in magical, and mythic kind of language. And one of the ways of battling was through riddles, and solving riddles and creating mental puzzles. And so I can see all of that kind of impacting me in different ways that kind of seeded interests later. But I read those books multiple times, and I love them mostly for the mood of them. They evoked a certain kind of mood that I liked to live in.
What was it like for your mom going through the divorce and going through the shift? What kind of observations did you make about her and the condition that she was in?
It was hard for her. She worked really hard to provide for us, but we ended up, like many kids at that time, becoming latchkey kids. When I grew up, we would come home as a boy. I would come home to a kitchen table full of all kinds of snacks and things waiting for us that she'd prepared during the day, and then art activities around the room. And, she was there for us that way. But by the time I was into junior high and high school, that just wasn't possible anymore. She was basically working in whatever way she could, driving a food truck and working at different stores, and eventually getting a real estate license that had her out all the time. So, and she was also drinking fairly heavily at that time, up to points of blackout. So, sometimes we would find her on the couch, passed out and maybe talking incoherently. And then she moved through that, and she got over the drinking, and she moved into AA and a kind of spiritual recovery. And so we all participated in that with her. She shared her journey. She was very open about the pain that she had been experiencing and the ways that she had tried to drown it, and began to, invite us into her process. she started, picking up spiritual practices. She got into shamanism. She would invite us to go on shamanic journeys and to dance our animals in the living room. And so she really began to open up her own kind of deep self-healing journey at that time. So that influenced us. There were different, men entering her life at that time. They're interesting characters. One was King George. He was the owner of the Texas Renaissance Festival and had his own island where they all lived in Renaissance style. And he was courting her and wanting her to come with him, but he didn't want us kids. So that didn't work out. She dated an Indian guy, and he introduced her to the Bhagavad Gita. And I remember, sitting on the bed with her, and we were reading passages about Krishna and Arjun, trying to understand that, in my early high school years. And eventually she met somebody. There's a lot to tell about kind of like all that happened and unfolded. She had come out to the countryside with an old high school friend to open a restaurant. That's the very first thing she did before those other jobs. She'd opened a restaurant with her friend, the Yellow Dog Deli. I drew the logo for it, and that was a popular restaurant for about a year or two, but they couldn't get along as partners. So then she was kind of cast out onto her own resources to try to find a way to provide a home for us. But eventually she met a guy who's a retired oil rig guy, basically literally a redneck, 6'6" guy, who also supposedly had stopped drinking and was on the same path with her. And so she got together with him and married him. And within 1 or 2 weeks, he was going on heavy drinking binges. And at that point, life got very, very sketchy. He would get into very dark places. You could really feel almost a demonic presence coming out of him when he was drinking. There's such a heavy darkness through his brooding face. He terrified my sister so much that her period stopped because of the way that he I don't think he ever abused her, but the way that he leered at her and followed her, it made her completely shut down her biological processes like that. So it became pretty intense, to the point, they created a business. It became $1 million business, gas station called the Hump and Pump. My mom had a funny humor, and because they sold alcohol, they wouldn't let them call it the Hump and Pump. It sounded too pornographic, so they changed it to the H&P. But that was an adventure, and she became a fixture in the town for that gas station, and they made a lot of money. But then he just got crazy in the drinking, and it just got really nuts, and she ended up actually going to a point where she tried to take her life. So there was this, pretty intense wrestling with life and death. And I've narrated elsewhere, in this environment, I had experienced myself not fitting. On the one hand, it was super friendly. I'd never experienced anything like that. People would just say hello to you from way down the street. And it's like, what's going on here? Why is everybody so nice? But it's also really weird. Lots of weird things were happening around me. Old man would take bags of garbage and a shovel and go behind our house in the woods and bury them. It's like, what's happening? Why is he burying stuff in our backyard? I found a deserted house surrounded by abandoned women's underwear and purses, and thinking, what in the world is happening over here? What kind of horrible thing is happening here? And so I began to experience this mixed world and bullied world. I'm going through a lot of things quickly, but I want to just kind of set up the intensity that it built to. In junior high, when my mom, opened the restaurant with that other lady, one guy found me immediately, and he targeted me as an enemy. And apparently he had been hired to do something for the restaurant and fired, not by my mom, but my mom's friend. But he thought it was my mom who had fired his dad. And, he would push me up against the wall and threaten me. And things like that. Hazing was a big deal when we got out of junior high. I remember leaving the school and there were people in trucks cruising around to catch everybody, throw them in the truck and take them out to the woods and torture them. And so I remember running through alleys and through the street, being chased by, teenagers, bigger teenagers on trucks trying to catch us and haul us off to the woods. Some of my friends did. They got really publicly humiliated, made to be nude and poured paint all over them, and all kinds of things happened to them. But I escaped, But going into high school, I had two enemies. My name is Robert Bruce. One enemy was Robert, one was Bruce. And they both were coming after me for different reasons. Yeah. So anyway, a lot of those things happened, but then a lot of friends died within a period of about a year and a half. One of my friends, Ronald, good friend, part of our crew, his dad was driving him more and more to go into law, and he didn't want it. He was an artist like us, and he ended up blowing his brains out. Other friend was playing with guns and just shot his head off because they were doing Russian roulette. Another friend went down in a helicopter ride. Another friend yeah, that one's a hard one. When I first arrived to the school, my first time in the lunchroom, this girl named Marlena saw me walking in and she said, "Hey boy, come sit with me." She knew I was alone there. She knew I was new there, and she made space for me. But a couple years later, she was out in boating and she fell off the boat and another boat hit her and she died. And another friend was out on a helicopter ride. The helicopter crashed. So just boom, 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 right? Then we got married. My mom got married. We moved to this other house. And our dog of many years, he walked outside within the first couple of days. The neighborhood kids saw the dog and decided to torture it. They chased it down on motorcycles and just ran over it to death. So it was this enormous assault.
Did you see your dad periodically through this time, or was he just gone?
I did see him periodically. Yeah. I don't know if he ever really knew the extent of what we were going through. We didn't really open up and say he was basically the weekend retreat spot. We'd go over there and he would take us to a movie and we'd do something and go back home. He could see some things were going on in terms of our own, shifts in mood. And, I was going into depression and anger. So, he saw that, but I think he wasn't sure what the root of all of that was. And he didn't approve of, my mom's new husband, but he was for us a bit of a refuge out of those spaces, And so in some ways we would kind of like willfully and willingly kind of forget and compartmentalize so that we were just in a normal space for a while. And I want to be careful not to say anything, I don't mean to say that my mom wasn't there and doing her best. And she was always a beautiful, loving person for us and supportive, but she went through her own darkness and we went through her with it.
What was the time period? Oh, I just wanted to ask, so much of this happening, there's such a sense of compression in it. And I'm just curious, what was exactly your age through this period?
I moved out there in 7th grade. So this was basically 7th through 12th grade, but the really intense things happened mostly between 10th and 11th grade. A lot of the kind of disruption and both on in the internal family stuff, and with the deaths. All of the deaths happened between, I think, my 10th and 11th grade year. And, there was a period where, I know I would drive down. We lived out in the country, and I would drive down, and I knew I could just turn my car wheel and go off the edge of the cliff. And there were multiple times that I ran at the cliff and then backed off, right? But that was in my mind at that time. But I've talked about this in other videos, but this was the context where I had my first, really, I think, my strongest mystical experience, which is one of my friend's mothers noticed the change that I had gone through, and she didn't quite understand it, but she knew something was pretty bad, and she knew a lot of people in the school had died, and she took me out by a lake and sat me down and just said, "Tell me everything." And it started raining, and she said, "Don't move, stay here, tell me everything." And so we just sat there, and I talked to her about it, and she said, "You need to get out of this toxic envelope, And she sent me up to California for a retreat up in the mountains at her grandfather's house. And so she sent me away and paid for it for a week for me to be up there in the mountains. And, I experienced such beauty and stillness and power. And there was a sense of being immersed in this field of living presence, that I could really see myself in relationship to that field of presence as this. I saw it as a chip in a glass. It's like a clear glass, and I was the chip in the glass, or I was this hangnail turned in on itself. And there were reasons for it and why I was angry and why I was depressed, but I could also see this was a posture that I was maintaining, and I could choose not to maintain it. I wanted to be like that presence that I felt in the mountains. And some weird kind of archetypal kinds of experiences that at least I related to them archetypally happened at that time that made me move towards Christianity. And this is not a conventional way to become Christian, but several things happened, one of which was I was out in the woods filming the trees, and I fell into a ditch, and there was a drainage ditch with a pipe, and I landed on the side of the pipe and just split my side wide open, and ended up, finding my way back to the grandfather's house, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. And I was riding on a bicycle, same week, and the bicycle got stuck in a rut in the ground and propelled me towards this very, very cross-like telephone pole. It looked very cross-like, and I just slammed into it, and then I flew off, and I injured myself, where I ended up basically injuring my wrists, my ankles, and my forehead. And so I said, "My God, I've got all the wounds of Christ," right? And that made me actually think about that metaphorically. It's like, okay, I need to connect to some source of meaning, and I need to connect to some source of healing. So that's what I never became like a conventional Bible immersed Christian, but I dipped into it as poetry. I dipped into it as a source of inspiration, as a source of prayer, and tried to find a mystical path of transformation out of all of that period of darkness. So that's where that started.
Curious about your relationship to drugs and alcohol, because you've got depression, you've got a deep interest in altered states, there's alcohol in the home. Obviously, you must have friends who are drinking and doing things. What was your attitude or conclusion about drugs?
At the time, I didn't want to touch them. I went to a party where people were, huffing glue and doing different kinds of things, and I never would touch them. I never drank. So I never touched anything. I never smoked, drank, did drugs. And I deliberately kept myself away from those things. I always felt that I had access to them already. I had access to depths in myself that I didn't need that. And in fact, I saw it being destructive. So I never wanted to pick it up. I didn't mention at this time that, in the high school time, I was working at a hospital, and I was delivering food to people. But in the hospital kitchen, I met a guy who was the head of the kitchen and a musician. And basically, it was Billy Bob Thornton's brother, Jimmy Thornton. And he had a band for a number of years called The Jones, and then had broken up and was now just doing this, kind of filling time. And, I made friends with him. He said, "You want to learn bass guitar? We can make a band." So he helped me choose a bass guitar, and I started practicing, and we made a band. We became the Dog Soldiers. And he is part Choctaw, so there was always a kind of indigenous spirituality that informed kind of our music. And so we went, pretty far in building a band and putting on some shows in Houston. And what did you ask me? Because there's a particular direction I wanted to go with that. What was the question that set this up?
Just sort of about your general attitude and conclusions about drugs and alcohol.
Oh, okay, yeah. The reason I was mentioning that is he had a drinking problem, and so did our drummer, and they called me the monk. They used to laugh at me that, "Oh, Bruce is the monk," but they actually wanted me to stay that way. I remember once I grabbed the whiskey that they were drinking, and I drank a little bit of it, and he just grabbed it out of my hand, and he stared at me and said, "You never, ever, ever do that again." Right?
What about girls? Did you have a high school girlfriend? Were you sexually active? Did you fall in love with anybody?
Yeah. I was very shy. And at this time, through the anger, I ended up getting acne too. So that made me more shy. It's weird. I had these premonition kind of things that it's like I saw at one when we were in the locker room, and I saw one boy with acne on his back and neck, and I thought, "Oh, poor boy, I hope that doesn't happen to me. Oh, it's going to happen to me." And then it happened to me. And so I was a little bit shy like that, but I did meet, there was a few girls I reached out to that it didn't really work. They weren't interested in me. They said, "Oh, you're morbid and you're cute, but we don't want to have any dating relationship with you," because they knew I wrote these weird stories. But I met one girl in the hospital kitchen, and Puerto Rican girl, and she'd been a wild girl, known as a wild girl, but she wasn't really. She actually just, moved in a kind of a tougher circle, but she actually had not, she didn't deserve the reputation that she had, because she was, just a tough girl a little bit. But I made friends with her, and then when I actually fell in love with her, or I thought, well, maybe I'm falling in love with her. I remember writing a story where I wasn't quite sure I was or not, but I really liked her. And I wanted to meet her family. And I remember I wanted to go out with her, and she said, "You have to meet my parents." So they brought me to her house, and I went into the house, and there was like about 12 or 15 chairs on one side of the room and one chair on another side of the room. And they made me sit in this chair, and the others filled up with the entire family. And they grilled me for like 30 minutes about my background and my life and my intentions. And was I going to take good care of their daughter? And, I guess I passed because they let me take her out. And, so we became close for a while. But one thing I really feel bad about this time is that there had been a girl I had been interested in who was I think we're spending so much time in this younger years, but there's a girl I had been attracted to initially, and she was so fun and free spirited. She was a preacher's daughter, but was like rebelling against that and just was like a super free spirit. I loved to be around her. I went to an amusement park with her, and she was just like so fun that I was just in awe. And I'd wanted to go out with her, but she rejected me. But then after I was with this other girl, then she called me up and said, I remember you asked me out. Do you want to go out? And I said, yeah. She says, well, you have to break up with that other girl, but then I'll go out with you. So I broke up with the girl, and then she never went out with me. So she was just playing a power game. And so I went back to Brenda, but she was too mad at me for having done that, and rightly would not take me back.
So where do you go after high school? And do you have anything in your mind about what you'd like to do in life?
At the time, yeah, I was I went to a Christian college, and I spent a number of years. My dad really wanted me to go to University of Houston, and I chose not to. I chose to go to this more expensive Christian college. And that kind of created a little bit of wedge with my father in terms of our relationship. He was disappointed. He'd wanted me to live with him and to go to school. And instead, I chose to go to this faraway Christian college with my best friend. And it was because I had visited the school with my friend. And even though it was a conservative Christian place and it was not where I came from ideologically, I had this beautiful experience of a cappella singing with 1,000 students in the dark in the stadium. And I felt such a sense of like participation in something beautiful, because they all had these 4-part harmonies, singing and soaring. And it was just amazing. And I just felt so enlivened by that connection. And I wanted to be a part of a community that had this sense of shared spiritual purpose. So I went to that Christian college for a few years, but was still mystically inclined and writing, mystical poetry and fending off the conversion attempts. It became kind of tiring because a lot of the times I was being invited to people's houses was not because they really wanted me to come. They just wanted to corner me for a conversion attempt, get me away from Catholicism. And yeah, so that was, I went for that for a couple of years. But then my mother went through a divorce with that second husband who was bad. And I had to drop out of school for a little while because of that difficult transition for her. And they didn't have money to support me. He was actually supporting me in that school. So then I ended up dropping out for a year. And then I went back knowing that I needed to continue with school, but without money and without a clear way to do it. But I know I needed to do this. And I didn't have anything. Our family was losing everything. They had had a very good business. We were now poor. And I filled up a hefty bag full of clothes. And I got on a bus and I rode 600 miles back to the school. And I walked up to the admissions office and said, I have this bag of clothes and no money, but I still need to go to school. And they helped me go to school. It was amazing. And I remember, different things would happen. I was living in a dorm. Somebody slid a little booklet under my door. And it was like a meal coupon thing. Basically, I don't know how much it was, but it was at least 6 months of food. So, that kind of support really touched me. In the end, my mother lost everything. And basically, lost the store, lost the house, everything. And my one sister had already gone on with her boyfriend. I think he was volunteering in Papua New Guinea. And my other sister was about to go off to France for a year of study. So I came home, and my mom and I basically loaded a little bit of things that we had into the car. My mom had been dreaming about having a guru, and to be out in the desert Southwest. This was around the time of the harmonic convergence. I don't know if you remember that, a New Age event that was happening back in the 80s. So I dropped out of school and went with her, and we had $800 in our pocket, a few things in the car, and drove off into the wilderness. And we basically lived in Arizona. We camped out, and at this time I had started reading Krishnamurti and Thomas Merton. I was thinking at the time of becoming a monk, and it not working out, but because I kept running into too many things that I didn't actually like in the Catholic Church. But I kept thinking I wanted a mystical vocation. But we dropped it all. We went off to the wilderness, and we lived for months out in the forest, in a tent, and reading Krishnamurti by candlelight and hiking in the canyon lands, and eventually looking for work. Nobody would hire us because we didn't have an address. And so it's like, wow, this is how homeless people become stuck. What do you do? So we eventually drove around and found a house that was for sale and empty. And we began to use that as our address on the application forms. And my first job was at a Pizza Hut, working the night shift, doing a little cooking, and then mostly cleaning the dishes. And that was a pretty rough period, because it was like it got to be winter, and I would be cleaning dishes until 3 a.m, and then driving out to the wilderness and hiking out in the snow and getting in a tent. And I remember getting really, really sick at this time. But there were also some really profound experiences of communing with nature, having kind of vision quest kind of experiences, having some other videos I've talked about, like these 4 nights of initiatory dreams that were at that point some of my most intense, really intense mystical experiences, and they happened during that period.
I do remember the harmonic convergence. Remember, my mom made us go out into the garden and hum one morning for the convergence.
Yeah.
Were you, did you feel like you had a living relationship with Jesus, or a symbolic version of the God-man throughout these years?
Yeah, I did. I really felt, a close connection. There were actually somatic experiences that I had that I felt connected to some kind of contemplative past that I didn't understand. There were moments of intense absorption where I don't know. I mean, this sounds kind of weird to narrate it, but there are moments of intense absorption where one of the somatic symptoms or experiences was of having a kind of like a light pressure on the tongue, like you're holding a very smooth stone on the tongue. And for me, it was like an energetic circuit or something like that. And I really felt like, is there an experience of like actually holding a stone in the mouth while you pray? Or is this just a somatic thing? But, I think I wrote a little couple lines like, say cradle, and a bowl is made in the mouth, hold the image there, something like that. So my sense was of, this kind of energetic word and communal presence kind of conjunction. I don't know how to put that, but there was this kind of experience with that was, for me, related to participating in the life of and spirit of Jesus. And I remember buying a little book of hours, Episcopal book of hours, and I would get out of the bed in the morning and open my arms and say, this day is yours, and then I would just go through, and I would step out of the class and I would go into these chapels, periodically throughout the day. And nobody at the school was doing this. This was my own little mystical thing of trying to stay connected and rooted in that. By the time I went out to Arizona, I was living in it in a different way. I was now living in the wilderness, and I grew my hair out long, and I started looking like Jesus, and I felt identified with Jesus in that way. But my exposure to Krishnamurti began to open, and Thomas Merton began to open me to a much bigger world of spiritual experience. And it ended up moving in other directions. But there, for early years, and including when I went off to Asia, people actually related to me as Jesus. They saw me and talked to me as if I was Jesus, and they gathered in circles around me and sang prayer, sang hymns to me as if I was Jesus in their midst. So those were some weird experiences, but there was that sense of being really identified.
So just to keep following chronology, you went back to school, and then you went with your mother to live in the wilderness. How long were you just living in tents with your mother for?
About 4 months, probably. And eventually we got enough money saved up that we got an apartment. And I wish I could remember the details. My mother remembers the details, but there were actually some really serendipitous things that happened that allowed us to get into the apartment. It actually allowed us, we had to let the car go. We couldn't afford the car anymore, so we left it in a parking lot in the Grand Canyon and let that be reclaimed. And we were just, really homeless and carless for a while. But eventually we got serendipitous things happen where we were able to get into an apartment with almost no money down and able to get a car with almost no money. And there were really kind of amazing synchronous things that happened that allowed that. But that's what allowed the momentum to get rolling, where, now my mom owns a house in Sedona, and, but it was really starting from scratch. And I remember we used to talk, though, and my mom used to say, there's a difference between having no money and being poor. And we're never going to be poor in spirit. We're never going to be poor in mindset. And so we really tried to live that, and just to, stay connected to our feeling of abundant participation in the world.
Did you have friends at this time? Did you have sexual partners? What was the rest of your social life like in there?
Yeah, I made some good friends there. I met one young woman that, this was already after my third year of college, and this was my first real sexual experience. And I mean, I've thought about writing a little autobiographical book called Night Shift in Shangri-La, just about my period of time in Sedona, because so many things happened there. But one thing that happened is I was working at a restaurant, and one woman came in who was a free-spirited woman on a road trip across the country, and she had a meal in the restaurant, and we just had a little conversation, at the table, and then she left, and she was on her way to California. But when I came out of work, she was sitting in the parking lot, and she says, I left here and I was going on my way, but I kind of like you. I want to know you. And I said, yeah, I like you too. And so we became friends. And at the time, we were living in a log cabin, a multi-story log cabin at the edge of the forest land before Boynton Canyon in Sedona. And I think eventually she became a roommate there, but for a while she didn't. She stayed somewhere else. But I remember there was my experience, my first sexual experience was we decided to go camping out by the creek, and we were hiking out in the woods, and we were deep in the middle of nowhere, and she had taken off her shirt. I was like, oh, wow, okay, all right. And so then we were going around, and I was still shy at that time, and she said, let's stay the night here. And so we went back, and we went to the tent by the river, and she asked me, have you ever been with anybody before? And I said, no. And she said, are you afraid? And I said, yeah, I'm nervous. And she said, all right, I'm going to help you. And she went in the tent, and she lay down, and she took all of her clothes off, and she just said, take your time to get to know the woman's body. I'm here. I will help you with anything. And so that was my first experience. It was a very beautiful and gentle introduction. And she ended up moving into our house, and in that house, it was a pretty wild place. We had a lot of people who ended up living there, kind of bohemian. We had ghost experiences in that house. We actually had a group of famous psychics who heard about our house and come from San Francisco to check out what they thought was maybe a portal that was going through our living room. So, I mean, it was a pretty wild place. We had a Jain nun who came and encountered spirits and did some battles. I mean, it was actually a pretty wild experience in that house with a very bohemian lifestyle, a lot of making music, a lot of art, a lot of mystical experience, and some good friends there. One of my roommates is now in the movies. He's been in Breaking Bad, and he does other films. And we had interesting group of people, typically Sedona kind of people. So there were some people who were way far out there. They thought they were walk-ins. I don't know if you remember the walk-in phenomena, where people thought that their personality had been exited and some extraterrestrial presence had manifested in their body. So interesting casts of characters, a lot of stories to tell about men in black encounters, UFO things, ghost things, mystical experiences. I mean, that whole period is just a kind of out of this world.
How long were you there for?
I was there for, probably 4 years or 5 years. And then I came back later and lived there again. But in the interim, I was offered a chance to go to teach English in Korea. Out of the blue, somebody called me, an old high school friend, and said, I'm teaching in Korea and they need a new teacher. Do you want to do it? And that started my whole Asian odyssey, because I ended up traveling for a lot of years after those couple years teaching.
So when about is this, like the early 1990s? When is it that you go over to Korea?
Yeah, it was basically right at the early 1990s. Yeah. And I went there for 2 years and did all kinds of teaching. I did, teaching within a hagwon, within a language school, but I also taught at the Shell Oil Building, and I also taught at the National Fisheries Institute, and I also taught for Nunopi, which is a school that was, that trains Korean teachers of English. And so, I did all of that, and then I also was trying to study Sun Buddhism, and I was also studying music. So I joined a Salmonori group, Korean percussion group. And I had no idea, but they were actually very radical political group who were pretty much anti-West. and also anti certain things within the government. And they did protest performances. And so I was a weird figure to be in there, but I didn't speak enough Korean to understand the instructions. So I just followed with my hands to learn all of the techniques. And I could tell he was scolding the class that this, foreigner who can barely speak the language is learning quicker than some of the students. But it was a nice experience. I ended up performing in parades, performing in theater performances where they were doing these very anti-government protests showing about kind of like the injustices of the fishery industry with the salmonori drumming. So yeah, it was kind of a mix of the art and the Buddhist and contemplative study, and then just lots of teaching. I remember I was really feeling cut off from the US and not knowing what was going on. And I finally got access to a TV, and I thought, I'm going to see what's going on American TV, that I was able to see that. And the first thing I saw was the room of the dwarf in the red room from Twin Peaks talking backwards and dancing. I thought, what the hell is happening to American TV? I was totally bewildered. So
I'm
So
wondering, sorry to interrupt, Layman. I need to probably just go to the washroom. But I'm wondering, how are we feeling energetically? Like, do we want?
Yeah. Do we need a quick break?
we can do that, sure.
Okay. Cheryl's back. Bruce has about a half an hour, so we're going to accelerate our tempo a little bit. We'll want to get to Krishnamurti, we want to get to marriage and reproduction, and then be able to spend a few minutes sort of looking back at your life from this moment as well.
Sure.
So how do you get from, you're in Korea, obviously you're probably still reading Krishnamurti, you still have this connection to the Christian thing, but you've moved on and started feeling connected to Buddhism. How do you get from there to the Krishnamurti school?
Yeah, Korea was a pretty intense experience for me, both positively and negatively. I really enjoyed the creative exploration there. I really enjoyed the contemplative experience. It was bewildering to receive so much attention from people, after especially living in the way that I lived in Arizona, and large periods of time alone and out in the woods. And here I was surrounded by people, and I was an object of attention almost everywhere I went. This was, Korea had not really fully entered the world stage in the big way that it is now. There's so much attention to Korea now. Back then, it was not like that. And there were not that many foreigners on the streets. So being an object of attention was a little bit difficult for me psychically. And, never knowing if the people who are approaching you are doing it out of an interest in you or for some other reasons. And, so there was a lot of experience of not being welcome different places, people locking their car doors as I pass, people saying, no, we will not serve you in this restaurant, things like that. So there was a lot of just feeling very, very much outside, and feeling at the same time very included in a way that where people wanted to be around me. And, when I had, a gathering at my house full of people that I didn't even know, but who wanted to come. And so I had not experienced those extremes before. And by the end of that 2 years, I was feeling a bit, I think I had closed up a bit. In Sedona, I had really opened up, and in Korea, I had kind of closed up again. But I had been hearing from one of my roommates some Indonesian music, and that really haunted me. I loved the Kecapi Suling and I love some of the gamelan, which I had heard years before in Christian college at a music appreciation class. But the kachapi suling, the harp, and the bamboo flute really attracted me. And that made up my mind. In Sedona, a friend of mine and I had seen this Ring of Fire by the Blair brothers video documentary of their tour through Indonesia. And that had fascinated me. And then the music. So when I finished Korea after 2 years, I had, about $30,000, $35,000 saved up. And I thought, I'm just going to take this with me and travel. I'm not going to go right home. So I went to Indonesia. And at first I lived in Bali for about 3 months. And I had some really, wonderful experiences in Bali. I got to know local people and stayed at their houses. And I began studying some music there. I'd go to these, musicians' houses out in Paliatan. They have these compound houses, and I'd be there with the chickens, and they'd teach me drumming and tinklik and suling. And I didn't have a lot of meditation practice at that time, except my own. But I was reading Krishnamurti, and I was reading, some Vipassana books, and I was still reading, Thomas Merton's journal about Asia. Then I decided to go for a visit over into Java. And just to see what was over there. People said you might find some interesting experiences over there. And I went to, I wanted to go study some music with one musician in Bandung, in one part of Java. So I traveled over there by bus, and I stayed at a place where I ended up getting dengue fever. I've told that story where I was, almost dying from dengue fever in a bunk bed at a hostel. And I had an encounter with a debus, a Indonesian shaman who I think really helped heal me. I witnessed him doing some kind of magical acts downstairs. And then he came and brought a cobra into my room and made me play flute for it. And through that, even though I was sick, I played that flute for the cobra, and I got better. And he invited me to go up to his village and study drumming with his shaman grandfather. And I was thinking about it. And I was thinking about staying there, and I went to the musician's house. But after having that experience, something just didn't settle with me. I felt like I was still too raw and vulnerable from Korea, that I wasn't ready for that kind of maybe intense immersion in the shamanic life up in the village. So I said, I'm going to maybe come back later. And I just got on the bus and started driving. And I got off in Surakarta in Solo. And a guy at the bus stop welcomed me and said, "Hello, you're welcome here. I have a place for you." And I had no idea who he was. And he just grabbed me, put me in his car, and took me to this place. And I went there and found out within 1 or 2 days that there was an ashram right down the road. And so I went and approached the ashram, and basically he said, if you agree to attend meditation class every night, I will get you a 6-month cultural Budaya visa, and you can live here for free. And so I did that. I joined the community. He gave me a room. And a lot of my life at that time was attending the meditation sessions in the evening, going to local resorts for a swimming pool. And he had a big library of spiritual texts. So I was reading everything. I was reading, Vipassana and Tantra and Hindu texts and Sufi texts. And I just was immersing myself in that. And then I was also studying flute with a guy out in a village. And I did that for a long time. And I ended up meeting an Indian yogi and tabla player. And he made some money in Japan doing commercials. But he was a yogi from Kedarnath up in one of the Himalayan monasteries. had done very esoteric things, including drawing mercury into his body through his penis tip, and very unusual kinds of practices that they had done in kind of intense tantric practice. But he kind of took me under his wing, brought me to Singapore. We lived with a famous Chinese artist, Tang Da Wu, and he has 3 mansions on Singapore on the coast, and we lived in one of those mansions and practiced music, went to art shows and played. And the Indian guy, my friend Dinesh, he kept telling me, Bruce, you've got to get out of Indonesia. If you really want to learn music, you need to go to India. There you're going to get master training, not what you're getting here. So I had become fascinated by some of the things I was reading in terms of like wanting to go more into Vipassana, wanting to go more into Tantra. And of course, I have my connection to Krishnamurti, so I agreed I'm going to go to India and see what I can find. And I went to Varanasi, and I did 2 things. In Varanasi, I went to Benares Hindu University, and I said I want to take Bansuri classes, and they set me up with a teacher. And then I went to the Krishnamurti school in Rajghat, which was on the other side of town. And I went there and I said, I would like to help here in any way. And they gave me a job as an English teacher, creative writing teacher, and also hired me as a person to take care of the Adult Study Center library. And so basically they gave me a free house to live in for a year in India on the grounds of the Krishnamurti school. And it was such a lovely setting right at the confluence of the Varuna and Ganga River by Kashi Vishwanath Temple. The road right out back was the road that the Buddha walked on his way to Sarnath to give his first sermon. So I really felt I had landed in a holy spot. And it was really a blessed time. I spent, basically all of my time doing Krishnamurti style inquiry, Bohemian dialogue, studying music. I would go to bicycle across town to Benares Hindu University and study the Bansuri flute over there. So there was a lot of immersion in that life and that world of Krishnamurti. I really had some of my most profound mystical experiences there, different, including one that really opened up, that lasted for days. And I only left it because a friend of mine was feeling abandoned by the new me. He knew that there was something really beautiful going on for me, but he kept nagging me, come back. Right. And I realized I could make that decision to stop the process, and I did. And there was, again, the interesting encounters with danger in this world at the same time that there was all this beauty. I've told the story about how 16 dead bodies washed up on the shore outside my house, and I watched them all decay slowly there. That wasn't death. That wasn't dangerous. That was just an encounter with death. But there was an Indian journalist who took me under his wing and became friendly to me, but it turned out he was running scams on me, and he did several things to try to harm me. He brought me out to Haridwar to witness the putting of the lamps in the river, and then in the middle of nowhere, and he just abandoned me in the middle of that. And he had me leave all of my things at a particular location, and then he abandoned me in the middle of this crowd of thousands of people in the middle of the night, and I had no idea where the house was that we were staying. So that happened, and I did eventually get my things and get back, but I reported him and confronted him back in Varanasi, and he sent a gang of 10 goons to hunt me down. And I remember being in the grounds of that school, watching this gang of people hunting for me. I was hiding up on a rooftop while they spent the day wandering around trying to catch me. confronted by, a yogi in an alley with a tree shul with a trident, holding me to the wall with a trident staring in my eyes. A lot of wild, confronted on a bus with two people holding scimitars to my stomach. And I just talked to them about their families and their mothers, and they let me go. So a lot of just weird mixes of experiences, the holy and the dangerous. But it was a deep immersion in the Krishnamurti world. I would eventually leave there to go on more intensive experiences. So I went to Malaysia for intensive meditation retreats, and I went to Thailand for that. And I went up to Nepal multiple times. It was and I met a Dzogchen teacher who became very influential in my life after that. But it was in the Krishnamurti school where I had a visionary experience of a Tibetan Lama in my room. And, he ended up pinning me to the ground and telling me to let go and let the razor blade that had entered my body go to my temple. And I let it go to my temple, and it opened up into this vast experience of the void, and this presence, centerless presence. And after that experience, I really felt like I need to find a Tibetan teacher. So I went up to Nepal and explored around a little bit, made a few mistakes in terms of, asking for Dzogchen teachings too bluntly. That was not the right thing to do. But eventually I did meet some really beautiful teachers and continued with that path for a number of years after I came back to the U.S.
How does this independent, world-traveling mystic musician menaced by danger with death as his teacher end up as a husband, father, and integral professor?
I wonder too. It was at a Dzogchen retreat that I met my wife, and she was just visiting a friend and had heard that there were some Tibetans down the road. She was in the U.S. to go to an AIDS conference. She was a social worker in Nepal, and she was just coming here to get AIDS education and go back and teach village women that. But she came and opened the door. I opened the door to her in the Dzogchen retreat, and she came in. I really fell in love with her right away. We became, nothing actually romantic really happened during that retreat, but we liked each other. And within months, actually, I had proposed to her. And that started a very new life. The very first thing we did, we went to live in Sedona at my mother's house for a few months. And then we transitioned over to Virginia to live at the Tibetan Lama's house. And I helped run his newsletter. And I lived in the basement of his house with my wife and one other friend, who is also a Hollywood guy. He's in Wes Anderson movies. And we used to talk to Owen Wilson and Luke Wilson and try to dream up screenplays for Wes Anderson style screenplays. But we were doing this. We helped kind of like establish the retreat center out there in Virginia. And we ran a travel business, Mango Mountain. We organized a retreat for about people from 20 countries, a Dzogchen retreat in Kathmandu, Nepal, and led a tour of the sacred sites. So we did all of that. But eventually at that time, I had rediscovered Ken Wilber's work. And I had read it before and liked some of his writings on quantum stuff and on holism, holotropic stuff. But I rediscovered it through like the Up From Eden and Atman Project. And I really found that he was integrating East and West in a way that I had been wanting to do, having returned to the U.S. after the time in Asia and being involved in the Tibetan community. I had been wanting to integrate East and West. And I really liked what he was doing, and recalled that the sound engineer for our band, when I was in the band with Jimmy Thornton, that there was a kind of a program out on the West Coast in transpersonal psychology and integral themes. So I looked it up, I found it, and I came out to California to get a master's in transpersonal counseling psychology. And at the time, I really felt I wasn't made for a monastic vocation. I loved my, wife. I wanted to have a family with her, but I still wanted to be involved in the world in a way that was contemplatively rooted and serving other people. And I felt like transpersonal psychology was a path to do that. And so that's what I came out to California to do. And I went through that. But how you become a professor, I mean, I don't know. I went through the school and I was thinking I was going to become a therapist, but it was so expensive to actually support a family in California and do 3,000 hours of basically no paid, service as a training therapist. You could get very little pay. I couldn't survive with that. We didn't, and she was staying home and taking care of our son, so we didn't have support. So I began just looking for other kinds of work. And I think one thing that really strikes me at this time that I was thinking about early this morning was how small my view of what's possible for me had been up until that point and even beyond. I remember going through diamond approach training that started while I was studying transpersonal psychology, but continued afterward. A big part of that work for me was getting in touch with the red essence, strength, and getting in touch with will to really begin to try to shape my life. And at the time, I remember saying to her, my teacher and guide, if I could just make $35,000 a year, that would be amazing. Up until that point, I had never even made that amount of money. And I was already in my 30s with a child and a wife, and 35,000 in California, where you're poor if you're under 100,000. That seemed big for me. Since then, I've gone on, of course, to earn more than that money, but it wasn't that long ago, 2 decades ago, that seemed huge. But, I think, one of the things that happens with householder life is that you settle into a certain kind of bubble. And I think a lot of wonderful things have happened in that time, but it's been compared to the world wandering danger and all and kind of bohemian life. I've lived a very insulated life as the householder. And I felt some loss around that, even though there's been some beauty and some wonderful things in that. A lot of it became about survival. How do you survive in expensive California and with a lot of intense student loan debt and other things? And so a lot of it turned into years and years of just work at multiple jobs to basically make ends meet.
And how do you move through the integral scene? Because when I encounter you, you're looking at integral post-metaphysical spirituality, and then we end up working on the integral stage, and that's sort of not quite integral diaspora stuff, but sort of trans-integral or meta-integrative stuff. So what's that journey like for you to get to the other side?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, I went through the transpersonal psychology training program, and then as I was finishing it, they opened up an integral psychology program, and I was disappointed by that because that's what I would have wanted to do. So I came back and said, I want to stay another year and get that and do my full degree with that. And so I did. I stayed on and took another year, and so ended up actually, even though I went through the whole transpersonal counseling psychology, my degree actually says integral psychology. So I think it's I'm right to say this, that I am probably the first graduate of a person with an integral psychology degree, because that was the first program that existed. And in that time, I'd gone pretty deep, and as always happens when you go pretty deep in studies, you both find and mine the riches of it, but you also begin to bump up against the limitations of it. So I was doing that. I was encountering the limitations of integral as well, and the Wyatt Earp and other kind of things were happening at that time. I went to Ken Wilber's house, and he behaved in some ways that I didn't quite like, and I commented on in the forum. I just thought he was risking his reputation to be another scandalous guru if he did certain things. He was asking people meet him out back and give him a blowjob and things like that. So he was doing it in a joking way, but I thought he's playing with fire to do that. And but when his book Integral Spirituality came out, I was fascinated by it, but also wondered if he'd made some wrong turns. And so I opened up a forum on, integral post-metaphysical spirituality, basically to study that book and to explore that book and to really find out what is post-metaphysics. And it ended up attracting, Sanskrit scholar who went by the name Kayla Mooney, and Edward Baird, who and a number of other people. And as we went deeper and deeper into the sources behind post-metaphysics, it gave me a lot more to look at and look from and look through to assess what integral was doing. And that helped me kind of like move into the more of the diasporic phase, partly through the kind of challenges and questions I got from people like Kayla Mooney and Edward Baird and other people. And then you joined, and we kind of began to weave so many things together that, there was both a deepening and a decentering that happened at the same time for me.
So there's lots more life we could still get into. But if we have a limited amount of time, I'd love to take a few moments to reflect on how much time do you think you have here?
I think I've got about, just 5 or 10 minutes. So.
Okay. To do some sort of looking back, I'm really curious about things like how your sense of self might have changed when you inspect yourself and see how it feels to be you. How is it different than it might have been 20 or 30 years ago?
There are a number of things to note. I think one thing that was very healing for me was to meet and partner with somebody who grew up in a Himalayan village in a very healthy, holistic, deeply rooted, earthy life. That was my wife. She had such a stable, grounded ego, not like the Western egos I've encountered who are mostly fragile and neurotic. She had so much groundedness in her own acceptance and her own ability to accept me without conditions, that was really healing for me. I had not encountered many people who were able to sit as surely in themselves. So I really think that she was helpful in some of my psychological grounding and healing. I do feel like the contemplative practice has borne some fruit in some, there were a lot of dramatic and amazing, for me, mystical type experiences, but what actually emerged through all of that is largely a sense which was present in my childhood in that innocence, but restored in a new way on the far side of this, of a deep feeling of the fundamental well-being of the ground and a contact, an immediate kind of felt contact and participation in that ground. It doesn't take any kind of mystical tricks to just like to feel it right there, right? So I've really noticed a shift in myself in terms of having that be a part of the field of the sense of self, is this kind of presence and this kind of sense of well-being in that. I still think, there are parts, and I've just been through the Aletheia training and I've done work with parts and things like that. And there are parts of me that I'm negotiating with and working with, but I think having contact with that sense of that ground helps me hold just the different parts in love. So if I'm feeling pulled by a part or captured by a part, these days it will still happen, but it doesn't last as long. And usually I can find space around it. So I really feel a kind of contentment in that. As you know, I just in the last year, because my mother did it, I decided I would try it. I did some psychedelic journeys. She's doing it in her 70s, and I thought, well, if she can do it, I'll try it. And I just wanted to see what was available to me through that. And I had some beautiful experiences through it, but it also felt like I don't need it. I don't really need to go through those moves to stir that up. It's there. It's there. So I don't need to. But I would say one thing that really came up for me in terms of my parts in doing the psychedelic journeys, I noticed when I worked with my guide through that, there were still some echoes from especially the time in high school. There was a memory riding down the road on my bicycle and people in a truck zooming behind me and throwing beer bottles at me. And that sense of being an alien here under assault, right? And not sure I'm welcome, right? There's still that echo comes up to me sometimes, and wherever I am now I feel like I'm in a job that's kind of a dream job for me. And there is that fundamental sense of participation and presence, but the part is still there that can be activated, that still wonders if he's okay here, if he's welcome here. And so part of my journey with the psychedelics was to really try to do some integration around that. I really feel, in some sense, what's unfolded, especially, I went through a lot in the last year and a half. I lost a couple friends who died again. My mother went into hospice. I lost my job of 17 years. I lost my house through a flood. And so there was like 7-8 months of no work, except for I was still teaching in the evening, but that's not something that's sustainable. So there was a big disruption and shakeup in my life. But now what's unfolded, I felt like I almost had to take zero effort into what's unfolded and the path that I'm on now. And there's a sense that I have a lot of responsibility to do justice to the gift that's been gifted. And that's really where I'm sitting right now. I feel like what I have the ability to do now through my new work and through my new connections with certain people, it's really a fruition of like all of that I've been on. And I can recognize that it's grown organically out of that whole path. And yet it hasn't come out of ego's machinations. It hasn't come out of the narrow self who's saying, I'm going to make it. So there's a deep sense that I feel like I am participant in a stream, in an unfolding that I just feel responsible to.
This is a really rich life story, and in media res, it's partway through. I really appreciate how open you've been with all kinds of different dimensions of yourself for us. And I guess my last question is around you moving to a position where people start to regard you as an elder, right? You've got a future of elderhood ahead of you. Who do you look to as elders, and who would you love for us to talk to on this series?
Well, I think, just because he's got a hot bod, I'd like you to talk to Tom Murray. Actually, I'm joking about, yeah. I respect him a lot. I look up to him. I look up to Roger Walsh as an elder and think that he would be a wonderful guest. Bernice Solimar, I don't know if you know her, but to me, she is such a beautiful soul, just an amazing woman. She's an elder for me, and she was one of the first people who hired me. She heard me giving a speech at a Diamond Approach gathering and called me afterwards and said, "I heard you talk at the Diamond Approach gathering. I want you to teach for us." And that's how I got my teaching job. But for her life is so rich and amazing. I think those were three that would come to mind as people I really respect. There's more.
Thank you so
There's more. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we may not get to them all, but I think this is a really important way for us to grow the network of who should be on this series, is getting each person's recommendations. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this with us, Bruce.
Sure.
Yeah, I want to echo. There's especially by the last half hour, I think there was just such a the sheer immensity of your life experience. It felt very palpable in my body. And it had this quality of, it's almost like any little detail I could have really tunneled into, and it would just open up into this completely different world. So it took a lot of actually almost like attunement to a quality of being with the whole in order to just begin to sense into that, actually the grounded well-being that I could feel like I could really feel you radiating from. So I feel really, really grateful. And I'm really happy that this is our first interview with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I felt really supported, and I felt a real connection with both of you through this. So thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. And I hope the series opens up a lot of beautiful vistas.